Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for June 9th, 2021. Well, summit season is upon us. President Biden will be leaving today for an 8-day or 10-day tour of Europe. These will include a G7 summit, June 11th to 13th in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. Then on June 14th, he'll be in Brussels for the NATO summit. And then June 16th in Geneva for the summit between Biden and Russia's President Putin. Now, interestingly, Biden will be accompanied on this tour and in these meetings by Secretary of State Tony Blinken. This is somewhat different from the way President Trump handled these meetings. Remember, he had a one-on-one with Putin. I'm not sure that Biden is trusted by his staff to say the right things or even remember where he is in the meetings with President Putin. So Blinken will be there to make sure that Biden stays on the talking points that were drafted for him. Now, giving a bit of a preview for this was Blinken appearing on Monday and Tuesday before House committees and then Senate committees yesterday. And what was interesting or perhaps indicative of what went on at these meetings was the absolute total bipartisan agreement on the themes of the imperial geopolitical doctrine. Russia and China are the enemy, and we must defend Western values. It's almost an Orwellian spoof. Russia, China, bad. Western values, good. And you could see this from one after another of the people piping up to both praise Blinken. Both Republicans and Democrats praised him for saying that the U.S. is prepared to stand up to Russia and China. An example of this was Representative Conley, a Democrat from Virginia, who argued NATO must no longer be a defense organization. Well, that's what it was set up to be in the first place. He's saying today it must be active to defend democracy. It must be an antidote to Putin and Xi. This somewhat reflects the statements coming from NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, who said yesterday that NATO now is a political organization as well as military. It's a military political organization or alliance that must be global. And this is part of the push to bring NATO into the Indo-Pacific region as part of the containment of China. And Stoltenberg has been very much out front in warning about the danger of the EU-China agreements reached on trade recently, warning that China is still a threat to the West. Then you had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. Now remember who he is. He's a longtime aide to Biden, and in 2014, he criticized the Obama administration for not doing enough to get rid of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. That Sullivan said we should be doing more bombing. Well, this was when the United States was sending floods of weapons and jihadists into Syria from Turkey, from Iraq, from elsewhere in the region, with backup, with training to overturn the Assad government, to have a regime change. So Sullivan is a clear war hawk on this. And here's what he had to say. He said that what Biden will do in the meetings with Putin is, quote, make clear what our expectations are, unquote. In other words, lay out the rules of the so-called rules-based order, which Sullivan's sidekick Blinken has been talking about incessantly over the whole period of time since he was named as Secretary of State. And he said, after we make clear what the expectations are, we will lay out what the response will be when Russia violates the rules. So this is clearly not meant as a dialogue, but as a putting down a marker to Russia, what you can and cannot do. Now, how does that facilitate dialogue among sovereign states? It really doesn't, but perhaps Putin would ask, does a rules-based order allow harming and killing civilians as is being done now in Syria and Yemen with the so-called humanitarian sanctions? Then you had Biden, before leaving, talking with Ukrainian President Zelensky. And the report on this said that Biden told him the U.S. will stand firm for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and aspirations. Well, Ukraine territorial integrity, does that mean taking back Crimea, which President Putin said is one of the red lines that would cause Russia to react militarily? The aspirations, does that include membership in NATO, which so far the U.S. has said no, but it's moving in that direction. That's another red line that Putin identified that the West must not cross. Now then we have the farce of the Biden administration reindustrialization and manufacturing policy. They released yesterday something called Building U.S. Resilient Supply Chains, Revitalizing Manufacturing, and Fostering Broad-Based Growth. Well, that sounds okay. Trump said he was going to revitalize manufacturing also. But what is this program that the Biden administration is putting forward? Well, essentially, it's an anti-China policy. They attack China for what they call unfair competition. And what this usually refers to is state support for leading industries in the area of manufacturing and technology, and also underwriting trade agreements. Well, these are the things you negotiate. But instead, what Biden is doing is saying that, well, we're putting forward a policy and this is what we intend to do. So someone should ask these questions. Did China force the U.S. companies to outsource and shut down the industry in the United States? Was that China who did that? Or was that the same corporate cartels which are pushing for wars for the purposes of building up the military-industrial complex? Did China force those companies to cut their research and development spending so we fell behind China in key areas of technology? Did they push deindustrialization in the United States? Is there any evidence that China is the driver behind the U.S. going green, which means we're not going to have the technology for power management and electrical production that we need for an economy? Further, you could ask, did China force the Federal Reserve to protect the bankrupt banks and the failed investment companies and the corporations when they implemented zero-interest credit policies to allow these corporations to borrow for nothing, to buy stocks to make some money while they were shutting down their physical production? Was that China who did that? Or was that the Congress? Was that the White House? Was that the Federal Reserve? Was that the policy of the private banks that are dictating the agenda? Now, the latest signs of disaster coming from this are a report from the World Food Price Index, which shows that between May 2020 and May 2021, world food prices rose almost 40%, 39.7%. And these price increases are hitting home. Your morning coffee, the gasoline to go to and from work because of the corn prices is affected. Virtually every aspect of American life is affected by this hyperinflation. And who's responsible for that? It's the policies of this military-industrial complex and the neoliberals who together run the U.S. Congress with a commitment for war and confrontation and a global free trade policy, which will ultimately mean no industrialization, no power and energy, and ultimately no human life. So piling on to this, of course, is someone you wouldn't want piling on, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post with discredited Scooter Libby. Remember him from the Bush days when he tried to undermine reports coming from sane intelligence networks that Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction? Well, Pompeo and Libby had an op-ed, and they reached this conclusion. The op-ed is about what should be done on this investigation into the charges that China deliberately unleashed the coronavirus on the world, which Pompeo has been claiming without any evidence and used to turn President Trump against China during the period leading up to the presidential campaign. Here's a comment they made. Regardless of how this investigation turns out, China must be punished. Now, could somebody remind Pompeo that that goes against the constitutional principles of the United States of innocence until proven guilty? This idea of evidence-free accusations, that was what was behind Russiagate. That's what's behind all the sanctions against Russia, against Syria, against Yemen, against China, against any country that steps out of the rules-based order. Well, is that in keeping with our principles? Well, maybe it is, because now apparently you can go to jail based on the same kind of accusations laundered through social media and the various security state operations. But that's not the American way. That's not the United States as a sovereign nation under constitutional principles. So we'll see what goes on. We'll keep you updated on the summit process. And over the next days, I'll be talking more about what should be done to address the hyperinflation problem, the war danger, and the fight to defeat the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.